So we're on chapter 21, on to section 2, and we're talking about the progressive movement and the presidents during this time that were progressive presidents. And we were focusing in on Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States. And we saw how Teddy Roosevelt became president in the midst of President McKinley getting assassinated. He was vice president, he became president. And we went over how his presidency went, and focusing on busting the trust busters, busting the trusts and the big business monopolies and such. And so we got on to the point, and we're going to go on with this whole video, kind of focusing on Roosevelt's presidency, his 2 terms as president, 1 part term. But anyway, so we stopped with Roosevelt and safe food. Well, Roosevelt read the book The Jungle, and after he read that book, as the whole nation was reading that book, he ordered an investigation into the meatpacking industry. In 1906, he took action to protect against impure meat. Congress adopted the Meat Inspection Act, the federal authority to investigate all meat shipped to see that it was sanitary, that they had sanitary conditions. So on to that, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prevented manufacture and sale of contaminated food and drugs. And also medicines had to label as their contents. So these are big deals back in Roosevelt's time that are very important today. I saw this video of him sitting with his, it actually was a movie put on, whatever, but he's sitting with all of his Congress and everything. He invited him over for steak dinners, and they're sitting at a table, and then he goes on and reads as he investigated these meat packing companies and read all of the atrocities in the midst of serving the meat and how the meat had been poisoned. Here he was serving meat, and they all kind of like, you know what? And they pushed the meat aside, So this was very important, so although the book The Jungle was really focusing on, labor and, to give America a heart towards against business in the midst of all this, it basically focused on the meat and the meat inspection, as that became very important, especially to Roosevelt. So very important time. Teddy Roosevelt named some of these guys as muckrakers. So who are the muckrakers? So many writers during this time, and including The Jungle, published works that were slanted and distorted in their presentation, because their views, some of their views were very, I should say, it could be socialistic. So disgruntled, Roosevelt compared them with the muckrake in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So you probably have read Pilgrim's Progress. Well, the muckraker was the man that was not looking up. It was so, basically, this man was so upset with the filth at his feet that he did not look up to see the celestial crown before him. Here's a picture of the muckrake. These writers, because of Roosevelt, would be called forever muckrakers. They're raking up the muck, but they're not looking up to the vision. Men with muckrake are often indispensable to the well-being of the society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck. So, muckrakers, that's what he had all these terms. Conserving natural resources. So the limits of our natural resources were starting to become evident, especially as the buffalo were being destroyed, and people were moving in and taking over, land in the West. So manifest destiny, it says. Well, Presidents Cleveland, Harrison, and McKinley set aside certain forest reserves. But Teddy, with his love for the outdoors and concern for the future generations, brought the need for conservation. So his chief forester, he would become very important in the future too, Gifford Pinchot. Lived 1860 to 1946, and he published conservation articles in what he called the National Geographic magazine and in other magazines. So Pinchot, when you think of Pinchot, you think of Teddy Roosevelt's one of his closest friends. Anyway, they would be out in the country or be next to the White House, and they'd take dips jump into the Potomac or River and everything. He was a close friend, and later on we'll see what happens to him in the midst of Taft and this driving President Taft, the next president, and Teddy Roosevelt, between Taft and Roosevelt, because Taft had fired him. But we're going to find that out in the future. There's a whole conspiracy type thing that goes on in the midst of this, and we'll discuss that later. In 1902, Congress passed the Newlands Reclamation Act, and this would initiate irrigation projects. So Roosevelt was into irrigation projects and certain dam areas for irrigation of the areas that were very arid and the desert areas. He would focus on the Newlands Reclamation Act. In 1911, Roosevelt put a dam on the Arizona Salt River for over 200,000 acres. So sometimes I didn't proofread too well here, huh? So, going on, he furthered his conservation efforts. The National Conservation Conference at the White House. So they had a conference there. The state governors, the Supreme Court justices, congressmen, businessmen, scientists, they all attended his National Conservation Conference. And he put forth a National Conservation Commission and established it with Gifford Pinchot, how you say it, as the chairman there. He says the nation behaves well if it treats the national resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation. Increased and not impaired in value, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt called the second conference then, inviting Canada, Newfoundland, Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada yet, and Mexico, together putting forth conservation efforts. 150 million acres were added to the National Forest Reserve under Teddy Roosevelt. He withdrew lands from the public sale and set them aside for wildlife preserves and new national parks. Theodore Roosevelt's foreign affairs were very, very important. So, first of all, let's talk about the Panama Canal, because that today is very important, because there was a 14,000-mile trip. Basically, the USS Oregon had emphasized this need as one of our battleships. They had to go 14,000 miles all around the tip of South America to get to the other side of the United States. So it would be so much faster to have a canal in Central America. So this Panama Canal would be a major asset to the world commerce. The United States had lands in both hemispheres, so basically now they needed to get to both sides, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The elimination of the prior treaty of joint control with Great Britain. So they had a treaty that basically said that this area would be of joint control with Great Britain. And of course, they had to work that out. So in 1901, the Secretary of State, who was John Hay at the time, and the British ambassador, Julian Punchfort Agreement. So it's the Hay-Punchfort Agreement, or treaty, Hay-Punchfort Treaty. So in 1901, the United States and Britain agreed that the United States would have sole claim to build a canal in the Central America now. The United States would be able to build it without Britain's enforcement or Britain's combination, and had to, basically Britain acknowledged that it had insufficient influence in Latin America and allied itself with the United States to ensure that this canal got built. So here's a picture, cartoon picture of Theodore Roosevelt, idea in building this canal so that this canal would link the Pacific Ocean with the Atlantic Ocean. So the Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty has to do, just remember, Senator Hay and the British Pauncefoot Treaty, so that basically saying that we could go ahead and build the canal. Choosing the canal. Would we go through Panama, or could we go through Panama? Or is there another route? Well, the Isthmus of Panama then was controlled by the Republic of Colombia. So I don't know if you see, but Colombia was right next to Panama, but Colombia controlled. It was only 30 miles wide at the Panama Canal, but the terrain was very rugged and very unhealthy. When I say unhealthy, tons of mosquitoes, tons of malaria and yellow fever. So they basically thought too, there was another route that went through Nicaragua. And Nicaragua was 200 miles area to go through, but it ran through Lake Nicaragua. So maybe they could use Nicaragua instead of Panama if it didn't work out. But there was a French company called the New Panama Canal Company that had made a little headway, and they had poor management. The French didn't want it anymore because of the tropical disease. They started it and a lot of people got sick. A lot of their workers got sick, and so they just decided to abandon it. But they really wanted to sell their company and their equipment to the United States. So they offered to sell their rights and equipment to the United States, first of all, to $100 million, but they went all the way and lowered it to $40 million. And so Congress granted Roosevelt to be able to accept this French offer if Colombia, remember Colombia was controlling Panama, decided that we could use this area and develop it into a canal, right? So here's where Panama is, right here in the midst, and here's where they would go through to link the Pacific and the Atlantic instead of going all the way around the tip of South America, which was 16,000 miles, cutting it short by 8,000 miles, which is quite a bit. So the Panama Independence Hay-Banao Varilla Treaty. Hay-Banao Varilla Treaty. So the U.S. treaty was for Colombia for the right of way. So basically the U.S. wanted Colombia to say yes, right? So we wrote them and challenged them, said we would like to buy this area, we would like to put forth a canal. But in the midst of this, as we were looking towards Colombia, Panama suddenly revolted against Colombian government and declared independence. So the opportune time had come. And France had basically said that this would happen. Well, Panama was always, running into revolts against Colombia for independence. But at this time, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, stepped in basically to protect Panama from Colombia coming and taking over. So the 1846 treaty bound the United States to ensure neutrality of the Isthmus of Panama. To the president, Teddy Roosevelt sent the USS Navy Nashville to protect Panama City against Colombia. So now here we are, here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt and the Panama Republic and Colombia coming in, and we're basically saying, okay, we are going to protect Panama now. So that now we could deal with Panama instead of dealing with Colombia, which Colombia did not really want to build the canal. In fact, they wanted to control it and not the United States to get involved. But now Teddy Roosevelt was dealing with just Panama. So in 2 weeks, just 2 weeks after that, well, actually 3 days later, Roosevelt extended recognition of the new Republic of Panama. So he said, 3 days, Panama now is a new country, right? And then 2 weeks later, Secretary Hay and the new Panama minister prepared a canal treaty called the Hay-Banao Varilla Treaty, which granted this zone 10 miles wide to go through here. Varilla is called actually, because you don't pronounce the L's. Hay-Banao Varilla. And the United States would be the sovereign of the territory now. So basically controlling the territory of the Panama Canal. The U.S. agreed to pay Panama $10 million, and beginning in 1913, $250,000 a year to Panama. And the U.S. agreed to independence and then paid $40 million to the French company. So basically saying Panama would have their own independence, but we would control this area and pay this $40 million to this French company so that we could begin to build the Panama Canal. The completion of the Panama Canal. In 1904, building began. But of course they had a problem, just like the French did, with disease, especially yellow fever. Well, Colonel William Crawford Gorgas, he lived 1854 to 1920, and he was an Army medical officer here and was appointed, and he basically knew that if he could eliminate the mosquitoes in Cuba, he could eliminate the mosquitoes in Panama, which he did. He realized the mosquitoes carried yellow fever, and so they had to get rid of the mosquitoes. So that was the conquest of the mosquito. So the first 2 years they spent burning brush and draining the swamps so the mosquitoes would not gather there, right? In 1907, President Roosevelt appointed George Washington Goethals, right here, in 1858 to 1928 as an Army engineer of the Panama Canal. George Washington Goethals. So the construction of a series of locks. They would have locks because basically in the Panama Canal, they found that one ocean was actually higher than the other ocean. So they had to have locks where they brought the ships up to the right levels. So then they could, as they brought it up to the right level of the other ocean, then they could bring it down. So that way the water wouldn't rush in and flood the area. So they had to have locks with gates for the water level to be raised and lowered. It was open for use in 1914, just as World War I was breaking out. So now we needed this area to shift our entire Navy from sea to shining sea, right? Basically our entire Navy now could go through the Panama Canal. The costs were $400 million. So, but this proved very valuable because it shortened the distance so much from New York to San Francisco that they could make this $400 million back in no time. Because now everyone would want to go through the canal, every ship. They would not want to go an extra 8,000 miles, right? So Latin American affairs. Okay, now we have Teddy Roosevelt dealing with Latin America. So basically looking as to speak softly and carry a big stick was his motto for foreign affairs too. Basically for foreign affairs and for trust busting and everything. But this definitely was a motto that he had for the Monroe Doctrine. And if you ever have a test question, they'll say, who said speak softly and carry a big stick with his foreign affairs? And you got to say Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's policy, in one of the Western African proverb, he took, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. And he let his aggressors know that the United States was prepared to fight if needed. The United States, he felt, was obligated to protect both Puerto Rico and Cuba, that we were their protectorates. So if countries from Europe came to cause problems in this area, the United States would protect Latin America, especially our protectorate countries. The opening of the Panama Canal would be a highway of international commerce. So he knew that basically all of the European countries would want to use the Panama Canal. But he also knew the countries around that area would be in a detriment sometimes or in trouble. And so he wanted to basically keep that whole area peaceful so that there could be international commerce. There's no way he wanted to have any kind of discrepancy of any of those countries coming in and causing revolution or problems in that area. So the United States would protect the area the Caribbean Sea there, right? Roosevelt intended to look after the best interest of the United States and the Western Hemisphere. You can see a picture. We'll protect this area. We're going to protect the Panama Canal. On to the Venezuelan debt controversy. Well, what's that? Well, Venezuela, a South American country there, was in debt in 1902, and it was controlled by a dictator who refused to honor their debts. So Venezuela had a dictator who said, well, we're not going to pay back their debts. In the midst, both European countries of Great Britain and Germany caused blockades to come into Venezuela and blockade their ports, threatening war. The German vessels sank the Venezuelan gunboats and started bombing them. So the United States came into for arbitration, but Germany refused to come to the United States. Actually, Britain kind of pulled out, but Germany refused to come. So the President Roosevelt warned that the German ambassador that if he would he would send the United States fleet in unless he submitted to arbitration. Basically, Teddy Roosevelt said to Germany that if you don't arbitrate, if we don't find a deal about this with Venezuela, the Monroe Doctrine or whatever, the way he looked at it is that the United States we would send our fleet and we would fight against you. So Germany ended up complying to President Roosevelt, and the situation was settled very peacefully in the midst of all this. Of course, they didn't want war at that time. The Roosevelt Corollary. This has to do with the Monroe Doctrine. So in 1903, the Dominican Republic, Dominican Republic is right next in the same island, Cuba's right above there, and then we have Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Well, the Dominican Republic in 1903, I should show you a map on that, but I will in the next few videos. But the Dominican Republic defaulted on its debts, just like Venezuela, to the creditors in Europe and threatened to collect by force. The Europeans came in and said, we're gonna collect and we're gonna cause force. And so in 1904, Roosevelt announced that the Monroe Doctrine could not allow European nations to intervene in Latin American affairs. Well, basically these countries wanted to collect their debts that the Dominican Republic was not paying. The same situation as in Venezuela. So the United States basically came in to see that the European powers were given no excuse to exert undue pressure on Latin America. So the Roosevelt Corollary expanded the interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says the United States would come in if European power started coming into that area of Latin America. But the corollary that Roosevelt put forth basically said, going on, that first of all, they accused Roosevelt of wanting to make a United States colony, which he denied, but he would not allow European powers to take over. So the United States took charge temporarily of Dominican Republic's customs to pay back loans and putting them on a sound financial basis. So what is the corollary? Basically, the corollary is it asserted the United States the right to interfere into their economic matters of other nations in the Americas. So what the deal was, and both with Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, the United States now with the corollary could come in and help them pay back their debts so that they wouldn't have a war. And so that's just what he did with the Dominican Republic. He went back to pay back their loans or put some way of negotiating them to put them on a sound financial basis. And that's what the United States basically came in to arbitrate and to help these countries so that they financially would be stable and not in the midst of unstableness and bringing in their debt collectors in European countries such as Germany. So now on to the Far East. The Far East, we think of what? China and Japan, right? The Far East, the open door policy. So what is that? Let's find out. So we had gained control of the Philippines, which is over in the Far East, right? And this had increased the American interest in the Far East, especially in China. So the open door policy was focusing on what country? China. So the affairs in China were very chaotic, with Japan defeating them in the war in 1895. And Russia and Germany had moved to take control of Chinese ports. So in comes Russia, in comes Germany into these Chinese ports. This is before China was a communist nation. So but both Russia and Germany were carving out spheres of influence, and Japan too, on China's coast to control economic trade. So the Americans were very disturbed, especially American missionaries and businessmen that already had gone into China. The missionaries were in China, some businesses were in China, and this disturbed them as for their ports being controlled by foreign countries, especially by Russia, Germany, and Japan. So in 1899, the Secretary of State, John Hay, sent notes to the European powers and into Japan not to interfere with trade and discriminate other nations, but to respect the Chinese rights. And he asked for an open door policy. So we have the Secretary of State under President Theodore Roosevelt basically going in and saying, with China, we want an open door policy. We want to respect your other nations, but basically now it's a term in foreign affairs used for the United States policy that allowed for a system of trade, an open door trade to all countries equally in China. So this is the open door policy that was set forth. But in China, something very significant and very traumatic happened. The Boxer Rebellion in China. When you think of boxers, don't think of your regular boxing gloved boxers, but basically it's a cult known for their calisthenic rituals, but they called them boxers. In 1900, after the open door policy, this new trouble flared. These Chinese nationalists called boxers rebelled against the Western civilization. They called the West foreign devils, and they wanted to drive us out, to drive everyone out, anyone of the West, and close down China. The hatred was really directed especially to Christianity and to missionaries. There were many, many missionaries in China at this time. The Chinese government attacked and murdered over 200 Westerners, and many of these were missionaries. Then they also murdered 1,000 Chinese Christians, and many Catholics were murdered too. So they were going about murdering anyone that had to do with Christianity and anyone that had to do with the West. So the Boxers took control of the capital city of Beijing and basically drove out any surviving foreigners into this headquarters. And so in this headquarters there, the leading nations sent an international rescue force in with 2,500 American troops to put down this Boxer Rebellion and rescue Americans out of China. So the Boxer Rebellion dealt a heavy blow to mission work especially, but ironically it says it only flourished more in the following decade. So what happened basically out of all the martyrs and all, everything that happened in the midst of Christianity, Christians became to flourish even more. Isn't that what happens with persecution of Christians? Is that basically the enemy tries to come in and kill them all, and more people become Christian. Same thing happened in China at that time. The European nations forced China then to pay $333 million and the United States to pay the United States $24.5 million. But the United States actually took this $24.5 million they were to repay them and used this to pay for Chinese education. So we never did take it from China, which really put us on good terms at that time. Since then, we're not, because, basically China is a communist country now. So the Boxer Rebellion in China. Then on to the Russo-Japanese War. I was going to say Russia, but it is the Russian, right? The Russo-Japanese War, they called it at that time. Roosevelt was negotiating. In 1904, Japan was angered by Russia's expansion in Korea and Manchuria and declared war on Russia. And Japan devastated the Russian army, which is really ridiculous because Japan's this little tiny island and Russia's this huge, gigantic country. But anyway, Japan devastated the Russian army and won the land battles, but did not have the finances or the manpower for war. So they knew they needed to negotiate after that point, because here comes Russia with their big, huge navies, and not necessarily navy, military forces, because they had so many people in Russia. The Japanese sent President Roosevelt on an offer to help negotiate peace between Russia and Japan. And so President Roosevelt thought if he continued commerce and Christian missions would be affected, he would do this. So in 1905, he called the representatives, I should say, of Japan and Russia to a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So they came to America to negotiate peace. And so the two parties, Russia and Japan, signed a treaty while President Roosevelt negotiated with both of them, and this settled the Russo-Japanese War. So Theodore Roosevelt was then given the Nobel Peace Prize. He was actually the first American to get the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for coming in and making peace between these two countries in America. They came to America. And so he was known now as a peacemaker, even though he was a fighter, huh? So, gentleman's agreement with Japan. So in 1906, the San Francisco School Board was concerned about the heavy influx of Japanese immigrants that were coming in. And basically, they decided in San Francisco to send all these Japanese immigrants to one school. So they would have to commute to all one school. But the Japanese government protested. And what are we doing with these Japanese immigrants in America? And President Roosevelt stepped in and again to work a compromise. So he called this compromise the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. So the Gentleman's Agreement basically said that San Francisco School Board would have to allow Japanese students to attend their regular schools. But the Japanese government agreed to withhold some of their passports from Japanese laborers coming in, because basically the immigration was influx was so much that they couldn't control. I mean, the amount of people coming in and the amount of kids needing to be in the school. So, but this eased the tensions, but the relationship with Japan was still very strained, of course. And he was possibly would close this open door policy with Japan. But anyway, so basically thinking maybe Japan would come and take over the Philippines. So we were really worried about Japan. And later on, we're really worried more about Japan, especially in World War II. So the Gentleman's Agreement, 1907, was an agreement between the United States and Japan. In this agreement, Japan would no longer issue passports to Japanese immigrants, and the United States would allow immigration only for the wives, children, and parents of the current Japanese for a certain period of time to reside in the United States. So that's just like a Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. The last I'm going to talk about here is the Great White Fleet. So President Roosevelt wanted to demonstrate America's military strength to the whole world. Remember, President Roosevelt, from the beginning, when he was actually in the Spanish-American War, before that time, he was into putting the strength into our Navy. So in 1907, he sent our United States Navy on a world cruise with 16 big battleships and a dozen other naval vessels. They painted them all gleaming white. He called it the Great White Fleet. And they sailed from Virginia all to South America, around South America, Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, China, and Japan, and then went back through the Suez Canal and through the Mediterranean Sea, across the Atlantic, and back into American waters in 1909. A 2-year trip, right? And he called this a goodwill tour. And basically, the fleet was welcomed wherever it went. Even in Japan, thousands of children came out singing the Star-Spangled Banner in Japan when they saw the Great White Fleet come in. But the United States power was now demonstrated to the whole world. So when Teddy Roosevelt would say, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," he was showing our big stick. He was showing our Great White Fleet and say, "Hey, don't mess around with us. This is what we have, a Great White Fleet," showing the strength around the whole world. So that basically is Teddy Roosevelt's administration. But I'm going to go on to the next video and tell you a little bit more about his life, and then we'll go on to the next episode of going on to Taft and on to Woodrow Wilson.